Kia ora, welcome to this episode in Season 5 of Recovering. I'm Frank Ritchie, Minister, Chaplain and radio broadcaster. Recovering is a Media Chaplaincy New Zealand podcast highlighting the excellent work of Aotearoa New Zealand journalists. Media Chaplaincy is a team of chaplains around the country offering free, independent and confidential support for media professionals. In each episode of this podcast, I sit down with a leading journalist to discuss the story that's had the biggest impact on them both personally and professionally. In this episode, I sat down with Jack Tame. Jack is a presenter on News Talk ZB, host of TVNZ's Q&A, was previously the host of Breakfast, and spent 5 years as the One News US correspondent. In this episode, we cover his reporting on the 2016 US election.
Jack, this is the tightest race imaginable.
This is just excruciating. Goodness me, hands up if you're getting a hernia.
The story highlights Jack's insight, his adaptability, and the deep understanding he has of his craft. Jack, it is a pleasure to have you in our humble little studio. You've been on my get list for quite some time, so it's really nice to have you sitting across there. Thanks for making it happen.
Oh, well, I'm humbled you'd have me here, and I don't know about Humble Studio. This is fantastic. I think this does the trick, doesn't it?
Oh, look, see, I love the different reactions we get because I've had a couple of people walk in and just laugh.
Right. It's intimate. Radio is intimate. You know, podcasting is intimate. And so, I think all the better for being in a nice, cozy space.
Talking about that, I'll just dive here for a second because you do radio and you do television. You're on News Talk ZB, which is great because that's where I get to apply my trade, and you are on television. Yep. How do you find the mix between the two?
They both have their own benefits, and I always think that each format makes you better at the other format. So, for example, the ways in which radio makes you think about connecting with an individual is very different to the way that I go naturally about broadcasting on TV. When you're broadcasting on TV, I often think I'm talking to lots of people. But on radio, I'm always reminding myself, no, talk to an individual if you can. Radio's probably the most stripped back form of communication it's possible to have between, in a broadcasting format, between a broadcaster and someone who's consuming their information or their broadcasting. And I find that radio is really good at helping you become a stronger ad-libber, so thinking on your feet. And those skills are incredibly valuable on TV because when something goes wrong on TV, it really goes wrong. And when people can see the whites of your eyes and you're freaking out, having a little bit of a background in radio where stuff goes wrong more regularly and you can kind of, roll with the punches a little bit more, I think is super useful. So I just feel really lucky to be able to have both opportunities because there aren't that many opportunities in New Zealand media anyway to be working on TV and radio. And I really do find that each format helps me in broadcasting on the other format as well. There's quite a lot of cross-pollination. Yeah,
it's wonderfully thoughtful. There's a sense, I think, for some of us that you've been doing this since you were able to walk. So has that sense of thoughtfulness and thinking about it deeply, has it always...
So first of all, I actually share that sentiment, in that. I think I was really lucky. I sort of stumbled into journalism and into broadcasting when I was 19, and I'm 38 now.
Yeah.
So there you go. Half my life has been spent in broadcasting, and I think the more time you spend in it, the more comfortable you become with distinctions, and perhaps the more you think about improving your craft in the little ways in which you make you better. Because, when you first start, or at least my experience was, I was always just terrified of everything. I was terrified of going live, terrified of having my first story in public, all of those things. And when you get beyond that initial kind of shock of, telling your first stories or being live for the first time, and you're able to actually think, we have a little bit of space to think more carefully about how to improve the ways in which you're telling stories or broadcasting. I think it's inevitable that that you are able to winnow down the kind of variables that will make you a better broadcaster. But I don't think about it nearly as much as I should.
To start at 19 is no accident. I'm guessing there was thoughts about doing it well before 19.
it's funny when when you get older, it seems really obvious when you look back at the kind of different formative things in your life. It's really easy to pin certain events or certain experiences on outcomes that we experience today. And I mean, for me, it's just so obvious. I loved reading the newspaper. So every morning when I was a kid, I would get up before school, and we had a really kind of like steep driveway, and I would walk up to the top of the driveway, and I knew that the newspaper would be thrown out of the van at about 6 o'clock in the morning. So I'd often be up there just as the newspaper was kind of hitting the driveway. I'd go down and I'd sit in front of this little fan heater in our lounge, and I would split the newspaper with my dad. And so he would read, say he'd read the front section while I read the World, or I read the Sport while he read something else. And then we would just kind of silently pass each other parts of the newspaper. Wow. And it was funny, I was going through, an old family album at Christmas time, and there was a certificate from when I was in year 5 or 6. I was about 10 years old, and it said, to Jack, some certificate of achievement in my class for his keen interest in news and current affairs. And it's like, it's such a boringly linear trajectory for me, and that I just was really, really interested in news and current affairs. I loved reading about the world, and I've never really lost that interest and that passion. And so, yeah, I was just incredibly lucky out of high school to study, to pick up an internship, and I've kind of been with the same company or companies ever since, which feels like something that used to happen, like my granddad, stayed in the same job for 40 years and got a gold watch on his last day, that kind of thing. And it sort of feels like I'm the only person under 50 who's been in a job for nigh on 20 years. But here we are.
Well, I mean, it's funny you say that, because I've watched your career, and I watch how you do what you do when I think about Q&A. And then when I watched another interview recently back in May with Stan Grant from Australia, and the way you conducted yourself in that interview, there is something that feels old school about you and how you go about doing what you do.
I'm like an 80-year-old man at heart, deep down. No, I think, I think I'm afforded a privilege in my current roles that actually very few, if any, journos in New Zealand are afforded. And the nature of the shows that I work on is that I just have slightly more time to think about things. The way I always describe it is like I get time to read the report as opposed to just the executive summary. And even just having a couple of days extra to try and digest information makes a massive difference. And it means that, first of all, you probably are able to go into subject matter with a slightly deeper understanding than you would if you were just spitting 5 stories out every day, as so many journos have to do as part of the kind of daily news churn. But as well as that, just a longer format. Like it occurs to me that in media at the moment, and this is a great example, there are kind of 2 different trends when it comes to the media that people are most engaging with, or the media at the moment. One is the snackable video, like TikTok, 4 seconds. If you haven't got me, then I'm swiping and moving on. And the other is long-form audio and long-form podcasts. And so it's curious to me that those are both experiencing this massive boom in popularity right now, because people either have zero attention span, that if you haven't got me, then I'm immediately moving on, or they want to actually sit down or go about their day while engaging in something that's much longer and considered and more thoughtful. Yeah, I mean, the most popular podcast in the world, right? After recovering, Joe Rogan's what, 3 hours, 4 hours? These sort of ambling conversations, and there's obviously an audience appetite for that. So I think I probably benefit from that, in that, as well as the really quick, snackable kind of clickbaity stuff, there is an appetite for longer interviews and slightly more considered broadcasting, and we can probably try and slip in there and do what we do. Yeah.
You might have that privilege now of taking your time, but that hasn't always been the case. I would imagine when you were the scared 19-year-old, you didn't have a couple of days to digest information when you had to get the stories out.
Yeah. I mean, I like lots of other journos, spent years in daily news and loved daily news, loved the thrill of daily news. I loved waking up in the morning I distinctly remember waking up in the morning and thinking, I don't know where I'm going to bed tonight. Maybe it'll be here. Maybe I'll be in my bedroom. Maybe I'll be in a completely different town or city. Who knows? And being delighted by that, the possibilities and opportunity that came with that. Daily news can be grueling as well. Really, really grueling. And so, I spent probably best part of a decade in daily news, and I at times miss it when there's a huge news story and there's kind of the real you feel this kind of shiver pass through the newsroom, and all of a sudden people are standing up and running across the room and all that kind of thing. It's amazing to be in that environment, but at the same time. And maybe it just comes with a bit of age and, young kids and that kind of thing. Sometimes it is nice to know where you're going to go to bed at night. And so, I feel really lucky to have had both sides of that.
Mm. That 19-year-old who was scared, how did you just feel the fear and do it anyway?
I'm sure there was a degree of cockiness, but the funny thing is, so when I started in TV, my first job was was working on breakfast, and at the time, they were just kind of doing live crosses were becoming a bigger part of the news, and we all sort of take them for granted now. I mean, you can do one on your phone, it's no grand technological feat. But back in 2006, 2007, it was a huge logistical exercise to go live. And, days of planning would go into it. And, sometimes to go live in the field, they would have to have a big satellite on the back of a truck that cost $500,000, and then they'd have to book the satellite time. It was really, really quite complex. And because live crosses hadn't been a big part of daily television news up until that point, a lot of experienced journalists were quite anxious about it. And keep in mind, TV back then was a massive event. This is the kind of end of the Paul Holmes era. TV1 News and TV3 News between them would maybe have 1.5 million viewers a night. Everyone would watch the news. It was there was a real kind of collective experience in watching the news every night. And so naturally, lots of these experienced journos who'd done amazing journalism, told amazing stories for years, being asked to do something new was an intimidating thing for them. And I suppose my point of difference was that everything was a new experience for me as a 19-year-old. I fancied myself as a bit of a performer. I'd always been a bit of a performer in school. But I was like, man, I am as nervous turning up and making a coffee for my boss as I am anything else. And, maybe this is a way for me to get some experience and to distinguish myself. And so basically I tried to throw myself into any live opportunities with as much gusto as possible. And like anything, the more you do, the better you get, the more confident you get. And after a while, I wasn't quite as fearful as I once had been.
You don't sound like someone who was getting burned out in the daily news, where it was really stressful.
Well, yes and no. Generally, no. Although there were a few stories over the years that I'd found really, really difficult and grueling. The thing that always attracted me to news and to journalism, aside from the kind of inherent curiosity in the world, which I think was probably the driving thing, was this, and this is going to sound very lofty, I always loved the idea of kind of being an eyewitness to history. And I know that sounds really grandiose, so just please excuse me. But I always felt like the richer the variety of experiences you could have as a person, the greater the wisdom you might ultimately have. And so I always thought about daily news in particular as kind of having some really tough moments and some really amazing moments, and that covering the really tough moments in a good way, that was just the other side of the coin to the really amazing moments. So, for example, you might be there on Great Mercury Island when Peter Beck sends Rocket Lab's first rocket into space. What an amazing thing to experience, right? Very few people can say they were there and can remember what it was like seeing him jumping up and down on that hillside, screaming with delight as his rocket, exited the atmosphere. But on the other side of that, you might be covering terrible murder or a car accident or the Christchurch earthquake. I remember, because I was born and raised in Christchurch, and I went down straight after the earthquake as soon as we could get a flight in. I flew down to Nelson and with a cameraman, and we stocked up our truck and, went down there with the rest of the TVNZ team at the time, and, we were reporting for a couple of weeks, without much of a break. And I remember I had friends who had died in the earthquake. The captain of my cricket team had been killed, and I'd sort of gone about the reporting relatively stoically for a few days, and then I remember I went up to a next door neighbour's house just to go and catch up with them, my childhood next door neighbours, and this is probably on day 10 or 11, and I remember we were talking about a mutual friend who'd been really seriously injured. And they said, oh, well, she's been really seriously injured, but she survived. And I remember I just, in the middle of the dinner table, it just seemed totally inexplicable to me at the time. I just burst into tears. And it was good news. We were saying, no, she's lived. This is great. And it had been kind of touch and go for a few days. But I just remember just this kind of being this, whatever it was, that, the emotion of it all just, kind of being overwhelming for this period. And I'm sure that lots of journos can relate to similar things. But when it's something quite personal like that, obviously it really affects you. I also found years later, and it was a kind of similar experience, maybe similar to burnout. But I had been working in the US for years for TVNZ as a correspondent, and the nature of the stories that you end up covering. Certainly over that period had a bit of a theme in that it was every 3 months or so I'd be flying off to some part of the country to cover a massacre, and these school massacres, and you'd be standing outside a school, or standing outside a movie theatre, or standing outside a nightclub, or standing outside a church where there'd been this massacre, kind of just repeating the same lines over and over and over again. And I remember just thinking man, what's the definition of insanity? like repeating an action and expecting a different result. And here I am just telling the same story, and starting to even wonder if what I was feeling was exhaustion about covering these stories, or what I was feeling was a kind of antipathy, which is maybe even worse. Just thinking, well, I'm here, I know how this works. Day 1, this happens. Day 2, this happens. Day 3, the president turns up, lays a wreath. Day 4, everyone goes home. Day 5, rinse and repeat. And so I do think there have been times, where the kind of the weight of stories has caught up with me, and I've felt affected in ways that I hadn't perhaps anticipated. And maybe that's burnout. I'm not sure.
I think if I can offer a thought into that, I think the antipathy in particular, I think is a form of self-defense. I think it's a way of distancing the trauma of the situation. I also want to touch back on what you said, and you talked about it almost apologetically, as if it'll sound lofty, being a witness to history. I think it's worth entirely owning that, because I think it's a good motivation. As young journalists come in, and they're in the hard story, and then they're in the light story, and that can get stressful.
Yeah.
I think owning the fact that you're a part of history here, and that future generations, when they look back, could well be looking at what you did. You got to participate. That's amazing.
That's incredible. It does. I mean, you usually ask journos why they get into the industry and what it was about about this vocation that drives them. And people usually say, well, I wanted to fight for the little guy, or I was driven to meet lots of other people and tell their stories. And those are definitely true for me. But if I'm 100% honest, there is this kind of selfish dimension in that I just want to experience cool stuff. And I know that the price of experiencing the really amazing things, being on the finish line as Usain Bolt runs through and wins an Olympic gold medal, traveling to dozens of countries on someone else's dime. The price of those really amazing things is actually the kind of traumatic things that you are an eyewitness to history to as well. And if you're not affected by both of those, I don't think you're doing as good a job as you could be. Yeah. But there is a selfish component there, I think.
Oh, I think that's worth owning too.
Yeah.
How do you process it? The big stuff when you're bouncing around.
So I'm a huge believer in routine, which I know is not like the kind of like sexiest thing to be trying to sell, but I have personally found that I do my best work when there is routine in my life. And so, for example, I do a lot of exercise. I have always prioritized exercise. And so to use the US example, I used to, when I was working in the US, I was a one-man band. I was there for about 5 years, and so I'd always have to kind of fly all over the US. The thing about the United States is very big. Yeah. And it's very easy for an editor in a New Zealand newsroom to call you up and say, hey, this thing has happened in Washington. You go, Washington, D.C.? And they go, Washington State. I go, okay, cool. That's a 7-hour flight away, and then I've got to drive about 3 hours after that. And they go, yeah, can you be there live for 6 o'clock tonight? And you go, okay, maybe. But the way that I would always operate in that role was I would always try and carve out space to go for a run for half an hour at sometime every day. And in terms of the long-term effect on me beyond that, I mean, in my experience, because it has been a very, the last 15 or 20 years, I think, in New Zealand newsrooms has had its share of trauma for all sorts of reasons, whether it's intersector in the huge contraction in journalism jobs, or just the nature of the job of the stories that we've collectively been covering. And my experience is actually that in the time I've been there, journos and newsrooms generally have been much better at supporting one another and talking about the impact of stories over time, and that has to be a healthy thing.
Yeah, even in the 10 years of Media Chaplaincy's existence, we've seen it shift quite significantly. Yeah. I think things like the Christchurch shooting were a watershed for that, really recognising what journalists were having to deal with and understanding that there's a responsibility to help people through that. It's been good to see. You're the first person, and I really like this, you're the first person who, I think, in the 5 seasons of Recovering, who has raised the value of routine. And I really like it because I think it's extremely valuable. I remember someone asking me, because when the Christchurch shooting happened, I flew down as a chaplain to support the journalists who were on the ground. And I remember someone asking me afterwards, how did I cope with it? And sitting there thinking about it, I turned to my routine. So I was in a different city, hotel room, catching up with journalists during the day, dealing with their adrenaline, the stuff that they had to see, and then coming back to my hotel room at night. And you'll know, at that point you're left with your thoughts. But as a person of faith, I have some practices that really ground me in the morning, prayers that look exactly the same in the evening. And I think it was those anchor points, that routine that I could come back to, knew what was going to happen, brain didn't have to do anything, went into the routine, it just managed to reset everything.
Well, it's funny because if you think about the nature of the job, and it goes back to that, what I was saying about daily news, where the thrill is, I don't know where I'm going to wake up tonight. It could be anywhere. The nature of the job is that actually the job has very little routine in itself, right? Because you're always telling different stories, you're always meeting different people, you're working towards different deadlines. And so actually, for me at the very least, having a kind of routine and the stuff outside of work is like a nice offset in a way, yeah.
Yeah, it's really
just
good.
Not very sexy, sorry, Frank.
No, I think it's extremely sexy.
Kids and journos love routine. Yeah.
And in a world that's addicted to novel and big and everything shifting and changing, I think that grounding in routine is so valuable. I think we humans respond to it extremely well. So I think it's valuable to have put that on the table. Now, you're the consummate media person, and so when you were communicating with my producer, there was a line that you put in there that was just the perfect tease.
Oh, right.
See, most people would throw something like this out and probably just give us the story. This is the line that you put in. Might worth be asking my highlight. It involves David Attenborough, red wine, and Antarctica. Now, I read that and I'm like, I have to talk about that.
Yeah, that's me putting how I said there's the two sides, you're experiencing the good things, you're experiencing the tough things. That's probably one for the good column. I mean, this is the anytime I'm asked to speak to young journalists or to try and sell the industry or the experiences you might have, I always lean on this story because it's the 10 out of 10. So I was very fortunate in that I got to go to Antarctica. I was there for 9 or 10 days covering a kind of range of stories. And one of the days I was there, basically Antarctica, New Zealand said, right, you've got the helicopter for the day, you and your cameraman, where are you going, what stories are you doing? So we got up in the morning, and you do this thing in Antarctica where, because it's so cold, obviously, battery preservation is a real issue. Mm-hmm. So I ended up gaffer taping all of these batteries to my body because we weren't going to be coming back to the base, and you had to be have enough battery to be able to film for several hours. Off we flew. We flew up to the McMurdo Dry Valleys, which is the part of Antarctica which has the least ice coverage. So it's the bit that actually reminds you that Antarctica is a landmass as well as a big white blob. And they have all the mummified seals that have been there for 500, 600 years. It's amazing. We flew up to Cape Bird, which is this huge Adelie penguin colony, a couple of 100,000 penguins. I'm lying there filming them, lying there on the ground, all these penguins running around me, running up to me. Amazing. Fly back around the base of Mount Erebus, and we're coming into Scott Base when all of a sudden the pilot gets a bit excited. He says, "Oh, guys, you're not going to believe what's happening." I said, "What?" He said, "David Attenborough is at Scott Base." And we're like, "Oh, what?" And he said, yeah, David Attenborough is at Scott Base. Get down. And the whole base, everyone's sort of really excited. Okay. Oh, what's happening? Oh, well, David Attenborough's here filming his series, and he's come to Scott Base for dinner with his producer.
Oh, wow.
So I go into the Scott Base bar where David Attenborough is kind of holding court, just as you imagine he might be. Everyone's sort of standing around him trying to be cool. He's doing his thing, and then I walk up to him really quietly, and I walked up to his producer really quietly, and I said, "Oh, I'm really sorry, my name's Jack, and I'm from New Zealand, and I work for Television New Zealand, and I think we're actually connected to the BBC, and I just wondered, is there any possibility that Sir David might give us 2 minutes for just a little thing, just a little interview, it'd be really special?" And the guy goes, "Oh, I don't know, just go and ask him yourself." And I was like, okay. Go up to Sir David Attenborough. "I'm really sorry, I'm Jack Tame, I'm from New Zealand. Is there any possibility you might give us a couple of minutes just for a quick interview?" And he goes, "Well, why don't I take this bottle of wine and we go and sit down?" And I said,
wow.
Okay. And so we go out to the kind of library area in Scott Base, sit down with these 2 armchairs, bottle of red wine, and I sit down with Sir David Attenborough, and I'm like, what am I going to ask Sir David Attenborough?
You haven't had the couple of days
I
to mull it over. I
haven't had a couple of days to mull it over, and I look terrible because I've been out filming and it's been, minus 20 or whatever, and I've had all these things strapped to my body. And so anyway, I sit down with Sir David Attenborough and just had this amazing kind of, 15 or 20 minutes sitting down with him, this amazing experience. And the whole time in the back of my mind, I'm trying to be as present as possible in this interview, but the whole time I'm just thinking, oh my goodness, like life has peaked, my career has peaked, I'm never going to be beating this. So yeah, there you go. So David Attenborough, bottle of wine in Antarctica. And one last point that I remember is that it was in the middle of the summer, and Scott Base is actually on a little peninsula. Yeah. And so out of the window right next to us as we're sitting there chatting away, there are all these whales breaking through the ice, going poof, and coming out to breathe through the ice. This is just this kind of absurd moment in life where, like I say, I sort of thought, well, this is going to be very difficult to beat.
Yeah, take it to your grave, tell your grandkids. Yeah. And they'll pass it on. That's a magnificent story. All right, let's dive into the main one you brought up for us.
Yeah.
It's 2016. You're US correspondent for TVNZ. Walk us through.
Yeah, so I chose this because I know a lot of the journos who come on and speak with you think about career highlights, and this absolutely is a career highlight. But the reason I raised it is a couple of reasons. Not only was it an amazing thing to cover as a journo, and I was been in the US for 5 years at that point. It was my the sort of you felt like you were covering the biggest story in the world, and you very much were. But also that election's result has, I think, really fundamentally changed something in me in the way that I go about my work today. Mm-hmm. And part of it is because I kind of missed the story in that me, along with, some of the biggest news outlets in the world, along with the now president himself, I might add, I didn't think Donald Trump would win.
Yeah.
And there were lots of parts of covering that story which in which my reporting was excellent, and I reflected lots of views, and I was really proud of my reporting. But I think the experience of him winning and surprising so much of the world has made me think much more critically about the work that I do now, and has made me interrogate my own expectations much more than I did previously. And so I'm really grateful for having been surprised, because I think it makes me a much better journo today. So maybe I can try and unpack that for you a bit more. Basically, as the US correspondent, I was running around all over the US covering the election campaign, and I was covering all the candidates as much as I could. And the way it works is you are a one-man band. So you go around with your little camera, and you turn up at these places for campaign rallies, you talk to people, you go to the political conventions. So I spent a little bit of time covering Bernie Sanders. I spent time covering Hillary Clinton, and I went to multiple Donald Trump rallies. I went to the Iowa caucuses. I did the whole thing for the 2016 election. All of the big kind of seminal moments of that race, I was there covering it. And it was a kind of an astonishing moment in that President Obama was finishing up his second term. And I think the kind of mainstream consensus was that Hillary Clinton would become the candidate and would kind of continue in an Obama-esque kind of way. But the thing that I hadn't appreciated, and lots of other, journalism institutions hadn't appreciated, was the level of discontent with the status quo in America. And I think the result on the night, as well as the kind of fallout from the result on the night, has amounted to this incredible repudiation of not just American governance and American leadership in the world over the last few decades, but kind of the ways in which liberal democracies operate, and the ways in which leaders of liberal democracies think they have been serving people. And I know that all sounds kind of like second-year poli-sci kind of stuff, but I just think, I think that result has fundamentally changed the dynamics of the world, and to have been there and to have kind of seen it unfold is a really amazing thing to reflect on.
Yeah, it's big. There's a lot of talk about trust in media, and I think here in New Zealand, some of the discussion gets connected back to COVID. But I actually think 2016 probably plays a part in that. What do you reckon?
Totally, 100%. In that, that you think about the big institutions in global media, the likes of the New York Times, who weren't convinced necessarily that Hillary Clinton was going to win, but I just think had not done a really good job of giving voice to the many tens of millions, more than 100 million people, arguably, for whom the current form of leadership just wasn't working. And they were just, I don't think those institutions had given anything like the voice that dissatisfaction deserved. And as a result, not only was Trump elected, and I will just remind people that Donald Trump didn't expect to get elected, right? In fact, election night in 2016, I was at Hillary Clinton's victory party, along with most of the other media, not just because we thought that Hillary Clinton was going to win, but because you couldn't really get into Donald Trump's party, because Donald Trump was just basically, he had this tiny little ballroom in New York because he thought, this isn't going to be it. I'm gonna lose to Hillary Clinton. That's right. I'll go back to business and that'll be my thing. But I think the media had not done a good job of giving voice to that level of dissatisfaction. And, I think there are all sorts of things that have contributed to that dissatisfaction. But I think fundamentally in the US, you have this massive slab of the population for whom life is much more difficult than it was for their parents' generation. Part of that is down to trade policy. Part of that's down to health policy. The reasons permeate public policy. And yet I just don't think the media had done a good job of giving voice to that. And and I think as a result, Donald Trump was elected. As a result, I think some big media institutions have seen levels of trust massively deteriorate. And and I think I think we feel the effects today in a big way.
This is a really interesting conversation to have, because you're standing in a situation where you've just put out ideas, thoughts, you've reported what's going on, you've reported what the predictions are, and then you're standing there going, I got it wrong. Yeah,
I mean, for me, I was like, so first of all, it has made me be more humble, first of all, about trying to predict stuff. Like, the best that anyone can do is when it comes to something like that, right, is it's like, okay, the polls, you have these incredibly well-funded, well-considered, supposedly pollsters who are trying to get this kind of macro-level information. In a country like the US, it is very, very difficult to try and work out exactly how 300 million odd people are going to vote. Because, if I'm at a Trump rally in Texas, the guy I'm talking to in line has a very, very different view of the world than the guy at the Jeb Bush rally in South Carolina, who has a very different view of the world to the Bernie bro at a New Hampshire rally for Bernie Sanders. It's such a diverse country that it is actually very difficult to go beyond the kind of anecdotal stuff and get a macro perspective on different trends other than to look at big polls, right? And so I think, for me, it wasn't so much that I was predicting Hillary Clinton was going to win. It was just my personal expectation that Hillary Clinton would win because, for all of the things that I'd experienced and all of the fervor at Donald Trump rallies, and even though Trump had, defied the odds and winning the nomination in the first place, I still thought, on the balance of everything, surely this guy isn't going to get over the line, and he did. And it's funny though, it was humbling for that reason. It just made me, it made me think more critically about polling. It made me think more critically about conventional wisdom, and it just made me, going forward, I think it always just made me, less absolutist about my own position on things. Like, it made me realize that actually all of us are fallible, and for all the information you might personally have, no one has a monopoly on good ideas, and no one has a monopoly on being right. And actually, sometimes being humbled makes you better at a job like journalism in the long run because you are more aware of the stuff you don't know. Yeah,
it's really good.
Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah.
I haven't found a good way to
much.
articulate it really, but it's just I remember covering a story on like the second or third day of Donald Trump's after he announced he was going to run, right? And I remember it was like a cross with Mike Hosking, and Trump had done the staircase thing. He'd come down the escalator. And then it was only 2 or 3 days later, and John McCain was a massive figure in US politics at the time, and he'd come out and he'd said, I prefer my war heroes not to have been caught.
Yes.
Or I prefer war heroes who weren't caught. And of course, John McCain was in a prisoner of war camp for years and, had suffered, terribly for the rest of his life. I think couldn't raise his arms above his head. He'd been tortured in this prisoner of war camp. He'd refused to leave until every man and woman who had been imprisoned before him had been released. And so he was this kind of archetypal, traditional, American military hero. And Trump said this, and I remember, Hosking said to me, what do you think will happen? And I said, that'll be the end of Trump. That's the end of it. He's not going to survive this. And I remember covering the Access Hollywood tapes and thinking like, this will be the end of Trump. This will be the end of it. And what I just hadn't appreciated, like all of those other institutions, was just how deep that vein of dissatisfaction and anger at the status quo had been. And I think, looking back at it, it's easy to look at these different things and say, that was obviously a sign, and that was obviously a sign. But, it has just made me perhaps slightly less less quick to jump to conclusions than I would have been previously.
I think the worse it got with Trump and the stuff that he said, I think the more it appealed, because I think people were looking for the grenade to throw into the system, and so the more volatile he looked, the bigger the grenade.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. And I also think like a lot of the dissatisfaction is warranted. Like I think a lot of people really have been let down by by leadership of the last 20, 30 years. I mean, you think about someone growing up in in say like a Midwestern state today, who grew up seeing sort of the expectation of every generation that you will have a slightly higher standard of living than your parents, right? That's sort of it doesn't matter where you are. That's kind of the general direction of human progression. And I always thought about people growing up in the Midwest who, in the 60s and 70s maybe just one of their parents was working. But that's all they needed. Maybe dad was a foreman in a factory, didn't have a university education, didn't need one, didn't have debt from a university education, could still afford a warm, dry, decent family home in the suburbs, 2 cars, maybe a couple of weeks vacation every year to the lake. And you think about that same person today and the opportunities that they have today. And it's like, well, okay, what's the best job you can get? You're going to be earning, $9 an hour without benefits working in a convenience store. You have drug abuse rife in your community. You have all sorts of health problems because healthy food is so much harder to come by than it was 30, 40 years ago. The prospects for economic progression aren't anything like they were in the past. And so maybe your kid signs up to go and fight in Afghanistan, and maybe he's killed by a roadside bomb. Or you can see how for so many of those communities, they feel like actually they've had a real raw deal, and at the same time, their politicians, generally on the coasts, of the US, are saying, no, life's so much better than it ever has been before. Everything's going great. Our economy's going gangbusters. Well, they're like, well, it's not working for me. So yeah, I think a lot of the underlying discontent in that election in particular is entirely warranted. And actually someone coming in and saying, the system's rigged, I'm a powerful guy, I can see it's rigged, and I'm going to unrig it for you. I can see why that's such a seductive message. Yeah.
And I think there's a caution there for us here in New Zealand. We're not immune to it. Just coming back to the experience of that, I don't know if you would have made a conscious connection, but the reflections that I hear there set you up quite well for a very different role when it comes to Q&A and diving into Q&A. Can you see any connection there?
Yeah, and that's perhaps why I chose the story, because I really strive to try and think critically about issues, and that's I see my job as kind of being a public conscience of sorts, which I know again sounds a bit grandiose, but also to try and to play devil's advocate, but to try and think critically about issues. Because I think flowing on from 2016, and with the with everything that social media has done to our public discourse and political discourse, I think the impulse for tribalism is just so intense right now. And that is a phenomenon on all sides of the kind of political spectrum. And so I think for me personally, reflecting on 2016 and reflecting on how personally I was surprised at that result is a very valuable experience when I think about public policy ideas today, because I remind myself that no one has a monopoly on being right, and no one has a monopoly on good ideas, regardless of their kind of political background. And often that conventional wisdom's wrong. And actually, it doesn't matter if all of these people or institutions are saying one thing. It doesn't necessarily match the experience of someone who isn't represented as well. And so I think, that's why I think of that as being quite valuable for me, because it's just a sort of humbling reminder to always try and go in and think as critically and independently and avoid whatever tribalistic urges you might have as possible. And I think for that reason, I'm really grateful for the experience.
I'm interested in your thinking behind two very different styles of interview. So I think about the interview that I loved watching. You with Stan Grant, who Australian journalist, out of the business. I watched you interview him, and he had some harsh things to say about the media. You just gave him room.
Yeah.
Talking about his faith at the end, just gave him room. There was just lots of room. Whereas some people might reflect in that classic view of what they think is going on with interviews, that when you've got a politician in front of you, always talking over them, always butting in, always going for the gotcha. But clearly, that's not necessarily the way that you're going to operate with everybody. So what's the difference between those two interviews? You've got Winston Peters in front of you, you've got Stan Grant in front of you. Two very different styles. What's going on?
Totally different styles. So when it comes to politicians, my attitude is that I am there not just to ask questions, but to seek answers. And in this modern era, again, politicians of all sides and perspectives are generally incredibly well trained at obfuscating and avoiding answering questions. And I just see it as my role, regardless of who the person is, to try and cut through that. And the thing is that most politicians are just super skillful in 3 or 4 minute interviews, which is the vast majority of their media, in obfuscating or talking around a subject or acknowledging a subject but actually shifting it immediately into something that they want to talk about. And so as one of the last real kind of political interview shows in the country, I just see it as my role on behalf of the viewer to try and cut through that. And I'm not saying I nail it and I'm perfect all the time, but that's what I endeavour to do. For someone like Stan Grant, I'm not holding him to account for anything. He's not a democratically elected representative of the people. He's had an amazing life and an amazing career. He's an incredibly interesting person, and so I don't feel a compulsion to immediately say, no, hang on, that's not exactly what I asked, and here's the detail that I was looking for. Why aren't you bringing up this? But at the same time, they both come back to this kind of central principle in interviewing, which is that I always want to listen. And, I mean, you will relate to this, but it's my experience that even though it seems like a super basic thing to do, an obvious thing to do, a lot of people, when they're interviewing live, are not very good at listening. Because if they're being broadcast to tens or hundreds of thousands or millions of people, they're nervous, right? You're like, oh, what camera am I looking at? Where am I turning next? How long left in this interview? If you're on radio, the same thing. You know, you've got the text machines going, you've got your producer speaking in your ear. There are lots of distractions and things. And actually, one of the hardest things you can do is really engage and listen to someone, to be as present as possible with what someone's saying. So in a political interview, that means listening to actually work out if they are answering the question you asked or if they're merely deflecting onto something they want to talk about. And for someone like Stan Grant, it's like just listen and let the man be interesting, because the man's incredibly interesting. And so it's such a privilege to be in a place where I do get to do both of those things. I think if I was just doing one, I'd be, I'd get a bit frustrated. But how amazing to have a job where you can interview a finance minister and someone like Stan Grant in the same show, and with quite different styles.
Do you have any practice to build that muscle of listening? And I ask because I do. I meditate, and I meditate because meditation has a rhythm and emotion to it. You focus on your breathing, 3 seconds later your mind is going to go wandering. You notice it, you come back. You learn to come back. You learn to be present in the moment, which I think builds the art of being able to be present and listen. Do you have anything?
Nothing as formal as that. But I put it this way: I know when I'm doing it well, because everything else is kind of superfluous. Like I kind of go into a zombie zone where I'm so focused on what the person's saying that I forget about the fact that we're in a studio, or the fact that I'm trying to make this interview be exactly 17 minutes 40, or the fact that I've got someone speaking in my ear or anything like that. I'm engrossed with what they're saying. And it happens, it happens from time to time. It doesn't happen all the time. But I know that when I'm in that mode, that that I'm likely to get the best content out of the person as well as the kind of the general broadcast. But it's funny what a challenge it can be, because it seems like such a basic quality, right? If you are interviewing someone, try and listen to what they're saying. But I tell you what, you can hear when people don't listen. And I'm like, I've become one of those incredibly painful, like scathing media critics who hear an interview from time to time. You know, someone will say, the flood came through and it was terrible, and all, the whole town's absolutely devastated about it, and we're not going to be able to return to our homes till 8 p.m. this evening. And then the interviewer will say, so when can you return to your homes? And they'll say 8 p.m. this evening, and they go, how's everyone feeling about it? They go, devastated, like I just said. You get the idea. But it's a surprisingly tricky thing.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. I like to think I'm reasonably good at it.
I think you're very good at it, Frank.
But the amount of times I have listened back to an interview and heard something and gone, I didn't hear that. I wish I'd asked more about that. It's surprising.
Same thing happens to me. I'll finish and then I'll go back and listen to an interview and I'll go, I missed that. I missed that. Yeah.
One of my great fears
I hate that feeling.
Yeah, and I think part of it for me is one of my great fears is that when the other person stops talking, if I've truly been focused and haven't been thinking about what I'm going to ask next, I'm going to have nothing to say, and then we're going to fall flat.
I reckon that is the number one concern that people have. So that's the other. That's a classic interviewing technique too, is to let someone finish, and then just leave it for a couple of seconds.
Yes.
You do that, like just let them finish their answer. Then just don't feel like you have to fill the space, and hope that they will fill the space and say something say something interesting, or just take the time to work out where you are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or they will. If it's an accountability interview, if you leave that space and you just let them keep going, they might get themselves into
trouble. Yeah. Yeah, sometimes silence says more than words, eh?
Yeah.
In interviews. I think, that's a classic technique. I think that's a classic, police technique as well.
Yes. Yeah. I'd love to keep talking about the art of interviewing, because it's something that I love doing. But I need to close this off. And the question that I always ask at the end, and it's been interesting to see how answers to this have shifted over 5 seasons. How do you see the future of journalism in New Zealand?
Well, I think journalism's a public good. I think it fulfills an incredibly important democratic role. And, I have been really distressed over the last couple of years to see so many of my very, very good colleagues lose their jobs. That being said, I still have faith that New Zealanders want to see their own stories and want to see powerful people in this country held to account. And while everyone loves to grumble, well, not everyone, but a lot of people love to grumble about the media, and I think the media needs to do a much better job of, scrutinising itself sometimes, which is one of the reasons I'm used my 2016 election example today. I think fundamentally there will be an expectation and desire to see those stories told in New Zealand and powerful people held to account. Now, I think at some point we're heading towards a reckoning where we just go, hang on a second, our current economic model incentivizes Meta and Google to make hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars a year and send it off overseas with very limited tax paid. Maybe actually we need some sort of public policy response that doesn't make all media public media, but maybe resets the balance a little bit for media. But I do feel optimistic that New Zealanders still fundamentally want to see their stories told and want to see powerful people held to account. And that does give me a scintilla of optimism. Mm. And when it comes to journos, I mean, I wouldn't hesitate to recommend someone enters journalism as a career. I would tell them, you are going to meet amazing people and you'll be an eyewitness to history. You're going to have the best work stories out of any of your friends. But the other side to that coin, the flip side, is that, it's going to be pretty tough tough. The job insecurity is real, and you're not going to be making much money. So maybe do it for a few years and then have a plan B as well. But yeah, I feel optimistic that we're going to forge on in some way, shape or form, but I do think it's heading towards a bit of a crunch point.
Jack, it has been an honour, and I want to say thank you. I want to say thank you for your enthusiasm as a kid, picking up that newspaper in a way that was not normal and sharing it with your dad. That's a beautiful picture. Thank you for entering into it. Thank you for feeling the fear and doing it anyway. Thank you for learning along the way, not just barreling through, but learning. Thank you for the self-analysis that has made you better and better at what you do. Thank you for being someone who holds our elected politicians to account. Thank you for being a model for young journalists.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Frank. Thank you so much.
Ngā mihi nui, Jack. Thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with me. Thanks to Radio New Zealand for hosting this series. And thanks to you for giving some of your precious time to listen. A big shout out to Mallory Carey, Mick Andrews and Josh Couch for producing this episode of Recovering. If you appreciate this podcast, please give us a 5-star rating and share it with someone else who would like it. And remember to follow in your favourite app to catch future episodes. At Media Chaplaincy New Zealand, we value our media. We demonstrate this by offering free, independent and confidential support for media professionals. With a solid and caring team in various parts of the country, we're here to help. So if you work in the media industry and you want to chat to someone who's there to listen, head to mediachaplaincy.nz to arrange a catch-up, and the coffee's on us.